Hi there. My name is Ole Martin Moen. I'm a Norwegian philosopher who is based at Oslo Metropolitan University. I'm really happy to be invited to give a talk at this conference, and thank you so much to the organizers for making this happen despite the COVID situation. Now, as you can see, the title of my talk is Are Psychedelic Drugs Distorting? And I want to start by motivating this question, by explaining why I think this is a relevant question to ask. And the background for the question really is the findings that have emerged over the last 15 years in psychedelic science. I imagine that many of you here are familiar with some of these studies and know that many of the findings have been rather astonishing and unlike the findings that we are used to in at least in psychiatry. We have seen that even a single dose or very few doses can lead to lasting changes in personality traits. For example, increased extroversion and increased openness. And also, we've seen lasting effects on nature relatedness, on feeling as part of nature rather than something external to nature, and also decreased authoritarianism. So a change in social and political attitudes and beliefs. And given findings like these, there's a question of what is going on. What are psychedelics doing? And one possible answer to the question about what is the mechanism by which they work, could be that users of psychedelics gain new knowledge from using psychedelics. They learn something, for example, about themselves or the world around them, or of their own priorities, of the value significance of various things. And if there is learning involved, that could explain why a single dose can be enough to occasion lasting change, because in the case of learning, especially learning something that's important, that is usually how things work. You don't need to redose. Once you've gained an item of knowledge, if it's important, that item of knowledge sticks. So, but if we're going to say that psychedelics give users or can give users new knowledge, there's a question of how that could be. How is that even possible? It seems strange on the face of it how a few milligrams, or in the case of LSD, micrograms of a chemical compound could give a person new knowledge, especially new knowledge of something, say, as complicated as philosophical issues, social and political issues. That seems to be something that just can't be contained in a molecule. There are some who defend, or who have traditionally defended, the view that we can gain knowledge from the use of psychedelics. Alan Watts, for example, has argued that psychedelics open our mind up to a part of reality that is otherwise inaccessible, which is a rather, I think, esoteric claim. And I think that it's in part in opposition to the esoteric claims that are made by some defenders of psychedelics, that there's a number of theorists who hold, I think, very much the opposite view, who hold the view that psychedelics, while they might have an impact on knowledge, they might have an epistemic impact, that impact is negative. For example, Owen Flanagan and George Graham have recently argued, for example, that the effects produced by psychedelic drugs are what they call metaphysical hallucinations, and even harsher rejection of psychedelics is found in Timothy Xiao, who writes in a recent paper that what psychedelics and also what other drugs do is to, quote, impair, destroy, or otherwise frustrate the function of one's cognitive faculties. And of course, if it is impairment, if it's distortion that explains some of these findings, for example, people are no longer afraid of dying because they have become convinced of an afterlife, for example, or they have gained some other esoteric beliefs, then we might have some reason to be skeptical about the usefulness of psychedelics. So then, are psychedelics distorting? Are the effects that they produce distortions? I think that in one sense, it's pretty clear that psychedelics can be and are distorting, in the sense that they can play a distorting role. They can make people see things that don't exist. They can make people confused. They can certainly make people less capable of doing like ordinary everyday tasks. So they can play a distorting role. But I would like to suggest that the interesting question to ask is not really whether they can play a distorting role, because virtually anything can play a distorting role. For example, say even a microscope, for example, can play a distorting role. Books can play a distorting role. Telescopes can play a distorting role. So, and we usually think of those things as epistemically good. They are actually means of gaining new knowledge. They're not per se distortions. So I think for the claim that psychedelics are distortions to be an interesting claim, it will have to be the claim that they are in some fundamental or essential way distorting, and that it's not the case that by developing a certain skill, for example, that we can come to gain knowledge from them instead. So the question really is the effect of psychedelics in itself distorting? That, of course, depends on what psychedelic states are like. And in the paper that this talk is based upon, I look at some different quotes from famous trip reports where I look into some of the effects that psychedelics are purported to have. I'm going to skip those quotes. I'm going to assume that those who are here are familiar with what psychedelic drugs might feel like, what types of experiences that they can create, and that I can therefore jump straight to 4 examples of psychedelic mind alterations that I would like to discuss, and that I would like to use as examples for discussing whether or not the effect of psychedelics can be said to be in itself or essentially a distortion. Now, the first, so you can see them here on the list. So one is alterations in color phenomenology. The other that I'm going to consider is the mixing of different sensory modalities, so synesthesia, heightened sense of beauty, and increased feelings of love and trust. So I will just take for granted in this talk that these are relatively prevalent effects of psychedelics. So let's get going. Let's consider these. Now, first, imagine that you're looking at a leaf. So it looks green, the way leaves usually do. And then you ingest a psychedelic drug, and you close your eyes and you wait for an hour, say. And when you open your eyes again, the leaf looks different. It might still look green, but it might, for example, here's an attempt at an illustration. It might be more intense and glowing and rich and saturated. So, and then the question becomes, so let's ask the question of distortion. Are we then distorted when we see the leaf this way? Now, admittedly, seeing the leaf this way could lead to a distortion. It could lead to a wrongful conclusion. If, as a result of taking the drug, you, for example, who had taken the drug, came to believe that the surface of the leaf had changed and that now it reflected light at a different wavelength, for example, then you would be mistaken. That would be a distortion. But it seems that it could also be the case that you don't form any such more conceptual belief about what is going on. Let's say you just see this, you take in the leaf in the way that you see here, and is that and we can then ask, is that a distorted way of seeing a leaf? And it seems that it would be a distorted way of seeing the leaf, only on the premise that the way that the leaf looks to us under normal conditions is the correct way of seeing the leaf. So if, for example, if the color of the leaf is intrinsic to the very leaf, and we see that color the right way during our normal waking hours, then there would be one right way of viewing that leaf, and everything that departs from that right way of seeing the leaf would be a distortion. But is that how perception works? I think that's very doubtful, because although our minds evolved to present to us light in the wavelength of like 500 to 570 nanometers as what we call phenomenally green, it doesn't follow that this is the only correct way in which light at this wavelength can be represented. It seems that it's possible that, for example, a cat or an elephant or a bat, or for that matter, another human, could see the leaf somewhat differently and have a different phenomenology. And it seems that it wouldn't necessarily follow that they would be mistaken or distorted in how they view the leaf. So it seems that they would merely, due to the makeup of their visual system and the condition of their visual system, be taking in the leaf and representing the leaf in a somewhat different way. So there seems to be a range of phenomenologies of light in the green part of the spectrum, what we call the green part of the spectrum, all of which could be equally true, or equally truthful, or correct. But notice that if we accept that, there are different ways that can all be right in perceiving something, then it seems that we must allow for the possibility and the reality of the fact that there is room for some alteration in phenomenology without that amounting to distortion. So even if there's a statistical norm, it doesn't follow that departing from this norm is a mistaken or a distorted way of seeing. So it seems that unless one believes that color really is intrinsic to objects, it seems that one must accept that it's not the case that we are uniquely right in picking up its color. What the leaf has is a certain surface that reflects light in a certain spectrum, and there are different ways in which minds can pick up that light and represent that light subjectively. And it seems strange to say that we, as we have evolved now, have some privileged access to how the color of a leaf really is supposed to look. So in that case, it seems that we can have alteration without distortion. So that was the first. It was the the changes in color phenomenology, which can happen as a result of using a psychedelic drug. And it seems, at least in that case, the alteration does not seem automatically, at least, to count as a distortion. Now, let us now go to number 2 on that list, which was the mixing of different sensory modalities. So in this case, imagine that you're listening to one of Bach's organ concertos, and it sounds nice the way his concertos usually do, but then you ingest a psychedelic drug and you wait for a while. Maybe you leave the church or leave the place where there's a concert, and then you enter again after, say, an hour. And now there's not only the sound. Now there's, even though the sound is there, you can also see some colors that are created seemingly from the music. You have an instance of synesthesia. You can imagine something like, an old screensaver that's jumping up and down and moving with the music. So your visual field has been changed. And let us then ask the question, would that count as a distortion? Now, here again, it seems that it might be a distortion if, for example, you came to draw the inference that actually now some colorful objects had entered the room that otherwise weren't there. There are actually things there that are colored, that are flying around. There are objects there. Of course, that would be a mistake, and in that sense, the drug would be distorting. But let's say then that you didn't form any such belief. Would your very color experience resulting from the music be a distortion? It seems that it would be categorically a distortion only on the premise that the air vibrations that we call sounds, if they were intrinsically auditory and just auditory, so that they were of a kind that you're just supposed to get auditory impressions from those vibrations. And if you get effects on different sensory modalities, that is a mistake. But that seems a bit strange. It seems strange to say that those types of vibrations that we call sound should only have auditory effects, and that they should only have the auditory effects that they are having on us under what we take to be normal conditions. Because it seems at least that we should open up for the possibility that animals could experience the vibrations from the music differently. And even if there was a difference there, it wouldn't follow that there would be a distortion. So if we concede that, it seems that we must concede, in the case of the mixing of different sensory modalities, that there probably could be an alteration without there necessarily being a distortion. It could be that when we are in a certain mode, or perhaps some other animals are such that the way sound is represented to them is actually visual. And it seems to be nothing inherent to sound waves that make it the case that those kinds of waves shouldn't be visual. That seems to be an implausible premise. So although it is possible to be distorted, in the case of synesthesia, it doesn't seem that we can say that synesthesia is per se distorting. So, and then let's go to number 3, which was enhanced beauty. Some things might look more beautiful than they ordinarily do. Aldous Huxley has a famous experience of looking at a flower while he is on mescaline, and he says that beforehand the flower just looks nice. It looks like a an ordinary good-looking flower. But let's say that you do like Huxley and you ingest the psychedelic drug and you wait for an hour, and then you look at a flower again, and it looks like this. There are limits to how beautiful I'm able to make it here, but imagine that the flower now looks stunningly beautiful. It's a much more beautiful flower than it was just an hour ago. Now, we might then also ask, would this be a distorted representation of the flower? Now, it seems in this case that it would be distorted if we thought that, or on the premise that beauty is intrinsic to the flower. So we could then say that, okay, this is a flower that objectively is, say, at 4 out of 10 on the beauty scale. But we see it as if it were 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10. And that is a mistake because it's actually just a 4 out of 10 flower. Now, that, however, doesn't seem to be how beauty works, because although there could be a fact, an intersubjective fact about how flowers like that usually look to many of us or most of us, it seems that beauty isn't really intrinsic to objects in that sense. So it doesn't follow that if there's a difference between how beautiful someone thinks a flower is, so one of them must be mistaken. So it seems that in this case, again, enhanced beauty doesn't seem to be something that automatically makes us justified in believing that there is distortion. So we've then seen 3 examples. We've seen the greenness of the leaf that suddenly looks somewhat different on a psychedelic drug. We've seen the music, or first we just heard the music, and then suddenly we can see the music. It has certain visual effects. It seemed in both of those cases that there can be a difference without a distortion, and that seems to be the case with enhanced beauty as well. And then finally, let's go to the last of the four points, which was enhanced love and trust. Now, here's a guy, and let's say that this is you, and normally you feel, well, a little loving and trusting, but not enormously. But then you ingest a psychedelic drug, and after, say, an hour, you feel greatly elevated feelings of love and trust. I should have had a PowerPoint here where he is actually just smiling and looking blissful, but I don't. But let's say then that you get this feeling that you feel very you feel love, and you feel trusting. Would you then, as a result of being in that altered state, be distorted? Now, it seems here again that you could be distorted. If, for example, you came to believe that others around you were more trustworthy than they actually are, then you would draw an inference from your experience that would be distorting. It would be distorting in the sense that it would make you believe something that is false. But let's say you're just having the experience. Would that very change in experience be a distortion? Now, it seems that even though it might be the case that an increased level of love and trust could make one out of tune with what are the customary ways of interacting in society, and therefore not fit very well with some of our norms and customs, it seems that the level of love and trust that we humans feel is contingent. It is shaped by evolutionary forces. It's shaped by what was adaptive in our ancestral environments. So it seems that we must grant that if our ancestral environments had been very different, then very likely our baseline level of love and trust would also have been different. But even if that were the case, it seems that those alternative humans wouldn't necessarily be distorted. And to make that point clearer, let's consider the difference between humans on the one hand and chimps and bonobos on the other hand. Now, it is the case. Here's a chimp. Of course, there are individual differences between chimps, but on the whole, they tend to be rather aggressive and assertive, and they can be pretty violent and have rather strict social hierarchies. So they have evolved, in a somewhat different direction than what at least most of us humans have done. But on the other hand, there's some animals, bonobos. They are seem, at least if we, for the sake of the thought experiment, we simplify a little. They are tend to be more loving and trusting, or at least so it seems. They tend to be more physically intimate with each other, and they have less hierarchical packs or societies. So we might then perhaps say that we could say that there's a continuum here where chimps are on one side and bonobos are on the other side, and we humans are perhaps stand somewhere in the middle. And let's say that what psychedelics can do, at least under favorable conditions, is to move us a little bit in the bonobo direction. We can be a bit more bonobo-like than we ordinarily are. And then we can ask, would that be a distortion? Would we be distorted if we started feeling a little bit of the way started feeling a little bit like bonobos do when it comes to love and trust? It seems hard to argue that we would. It seems that for that to be the case, we would have to say that actually we humans have the correct level of love and trust, and bonobos actually are mistaken. This is not the level of love and trust that is the correct one. And also, presumably, the chimps are also distorted because that's not how one should feel. Now, it seems that even though there could be conflicts that would arise, and it could be inconvenient to be too loving and trusting, it could certainly make people make mistakes, for example, about whom to trust. But it seems nevertheless that there's nothing objective about what sort of level of trust and love one should feel. And it seems strange to claim that actually other species are distorted in their lovingness and trustingness, while we are the ones who are right. So I take it that in this case as well, we have to allow for there to be some alteration without there being distortion. That seems to be the case on all of these examples. It seems to be the case with color phenomenology. It seems to be the case with synesthesia. It seems to be the case with beauty and beauty perception. And it also seems to be the case with respect to being loving and trusting. So on all of these parameters, there's at least a certain range where we can say that there can be difference without there being distortion. And in order to reject that view, one would need to hold what in psychology and also in philosophy is called a naive realist view about the human mind. So, and in order to understand what is involved in naive realism. Naive realists hold that we see the world as it actually really is. So an illustration of that view could be that we see the world as if through a pair of glasses, where nothing is added, nothing is subtracted, nothing is skewed. We just see through our minds the world as it actually is. So, and I think this is an important issue in discussing psychedelics, and especially the philosophy of psychedelics, because if one holds this view, if one holds a naive realist view of the human mind, then it's pretty obvious that there would be nothing that we could gain. We couldn't gain any new knowledge by doing things with a lens. So if we started, stretching or pushing or twisting or doing something with a lens, that would only lead to distortions. We would be epistemically worse off if we did that. If naive realism is true, therefore, making changes to our lens or to our way of seeing the world can only be a distortion. But given what the last century and a half of psychological research has told us, it seems pretty clear that that's not how our minds work. We don't just pick up the world exactly like it is. Our minds might be more like a lens of this kind. Or perhaps like a funhouse mirror. It might be thinner somewhere, thicker somewhere else. We might see some things might be enhanced visually to us. Other things might not be seen at all. We are prone to lots of biases. So I think if we're going to have a picture of how the human mind works, I think the glass, or the curved glass that we can see here, is a more accurate presentation. And so this would be then an example of rejecting a naive realist view of perception. And notice that if that is the way we think the human mind is, if it's like a curved glass, then suddenly we can see that it could actually be possible to gain some new knowledge about the world by making alterations to the glass. If it's just a thin glass, you can only introduce distortion. But if it's this curved glass, then it seems that by making somewhat different, slightly different curves to the glass, we could come to see things that we otherwise wouldn't notice. So even though in that case, even if on the thick lens view of the human mind, it could be that we are distorted by doing something, by making an alteration to it, turning it, for example, that doesn't seem to be the only option. So I'm suggesting that how we view psychedelic drugs depends, and other drugs as well, and their impact on human cognition depends on which of these models that we accept. And I'm predicting that the more we lean towards the curved view, the more we will be open to the suggestion that we could gain knowledge in virtue of using psychedelic drugs. That, of course, is not to say that to claim that one could gain new knowledge from the use of psychedelic drugs doesn't mean that one holds the psychedelic way of mental functioning to be superior to normal everyday experiences, or normal everyday perception. It would the knowledge claim, the claim that we could actually gain knowledge from the use of psychedelics, would be a more moderate claim, a more modest claim. It would be the claim that if we can have our ordinary everyday perception, but sometimes also have this altered state, then jointly these two modes of mental functioning could give us more information, make other things salient to us, and could give us richer knowledge, more knowledge than just having one of them at the same time. That's how it is with telescopes and microscopes. They are epistemically useful, but that doesn't, of course, mean that we would be better off if we were looking through a microscope or a telescope all the time. It's rather that this can be something that can supplement our cognition. So the point that I'm arguing here is that or what I'm suggesting is that very likely, or my hypothesis is that the view that psychedelics are distorting is correlated, is positively correlated with a naive, realist picture of the human mind, and that once we reject the naive, realist picture, we have a reason to be much more accepting of the possibility of psychedelic knowledge gains. And this is a philosophical conclusion, but it's actually one that can be empirically tested. It would be interesting if someone were to study whether there's actually a positive correlation between being a naive realist about perception and being dismissive of potential knowledge gains from the use of psychedelics. And it also has some implications for advocacy for psychedelics, because if the underlying challenge is naive realism, then it seems that many disagreements about psychedelic drugs cannot really be settled by discussing neuroscientific or psychiatric findings about psychedelics, because the reason for the disagreement doesn't really lie on empirical issues, but it lies on the philosophical premises or assumptions about the human mind that are brought to the discussion. And in that case, it might be that an effective way forward for defending psychedelics would not just be to report on the findings of psychedelic drugs specifically, but to address head-on the philosophical issues and to seek to challenge naive realism, both in academia and in the culture at large. Thank you.